Welcome to the Listen Up podcast, where we explore hearing loss, communication, connections, and health.
Hey everybody, Dr. Mark Sims here. I'm the host of the Listen Up podcast, where I feature top leaders in healthcare. This episode is brought to you by Listen Up Hearing Center. I help patients to effectively treat their hearing loss so that they can connect better with their friends and family and remain independent. The reason I'm so passionate about helping patients is because I lost my brother Robbie twice. First from his hearing loss from radiation to his brain tumor, and then when he passed away. I only care for ears on the E of ENT. I've performed over 10,000 ear surgeries over the past 20 years and taken care of many more patients with hearing loss. I'm the founder of Arizona Hearing Center and Listen Up Hearing Center. I've also authored a book called Listen Up, A Physician's Guide to Effectively Treating Your Hearing Loss. If you want to learn more about that, go to listenuphearing.com. That's listenuphearing.com. Today, I have a great guest. It's Dr. Greer Clark. He's somebody who's have made outstanding contributions to the field of audiology over the past 40 years through teaching, research, clinical work, and the author of a seminal textbook. He received his clinical training at the University of Texas, Austin, and his doctorate at University of Cincinnati. He's a professor emeritus at University of Cincinnati and helps teach doctoral audiology candidates. Dr. Clark is an exceptional educator as both a professor and author. His research and teaching focused on amplification, rehabilitation, counseling, and animal audiology. He's an author of the book, which has had a direct impact on audiology education and is well-regarded popular textbook, Introduction to Audiology. He wrote that with Dr. Fred Martin. He's helped move AUD education effectively towards patient and family-centered care. The impact of his work has been profound on the field of audiology and will be felt for a very long time. When people kind of say, get me somebody who wrote the book, Dr. Clark actually did. I'm excited to have him on this podcast. Dr. Clark, John, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Oh, that's great. So tell me, I want to know how people got into audiology. I mean, it's a fascinating field, but what was your story? Like, how did you end up in this field?
In roundabout way. Some people have stories, yourself included, family members and that sort of thing that kind of guided them there. I was both went to get my undergraduate degree because I enjoyed studying, but also that was something my family did. Both my parents had, but I didn't know what I was going to major in, and I just floundered around. It probably was not that I took an introductory course to communication science. The audiology section just kind of hit me, and I said, "Oh, this sounds interesting." And the more I got in, I think it seemed.
Yeah, sounds great. So you really stumbled into the field.
I did.
And then, so went all the way through, got a PhD, so went to the most advanced level at the time, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. And so I know you've been involved in, kind of where I've learned about you is the Introduction to Audiology textbook, which I don't know, what edition is it in at this point?
It's starting on the 14th edition.
So there you go. So many, many editions. So, and I, have audiology students at my office, and I've seen them carry it and look at it and reference it. And we have a copy in our office as well. So one of the things I want to talk about is the concept of audibility. Can you explain to the audience what that term means? It's not something necessarily used commonly to discuss hearing loss with patients, but can you talk about that concept?
Yeah, I can try.
Okay,
audibility is what it sounds like. Things are audible to you. Things aren't as audible as we'd like them to be. The biggest problem is ear can't tolerate restoration of audibility to the fullest extent. Research basically shows that if you've got something back up for just, we give numbers to loudness, just like you give numbers to temperature. The louder the number. And research shows that you can only restore about half of what was lost. If a person has a 60 decibel hearing loss, which is a fairly common among older adults, you could restore it to 30 decibels. So your audibility turned about halfway. What does 30 decibels mean? There is an assignment. At least I always thought it was illustrated, frustrated students, I think, but it gave to the students in my audiology class. And I told them to go down to the clinic and get some industrial earplugs and put them in their ear and leave them in all day. Just pick one day and wear them all day, and then write a short essay on the chance of doing that. Invariably, they would write about they were frustrated as well as they'd like. Their family members or friends were frustrated with them. You have all day. People were complaining the TV was louder than they wanted. It was social isolated. They would be invited to go out for the evening. They'd say, I'm wearing these earplugs. But I do it all day, and I know I don't hear that well. I won't enjoy myself. I'll just stay home. And afterwards in class, when we discussed it, we talked about the fact that the earplugs gave hearing loss, meaning sounds just aren't conducted into the hearing nerve the way they should be. But they're fine. So they didn't have any of the distortion that sounds can get that most of their patients have. Patients don't have conductive hearing loss. Most of their patients have the sensory neural or nerve type hearing. And the earplugs only giving about a 20 decibel loss, which is a 30 decibel residual loss that the patients have if they have a 60 dB hearing loss. The best hearing aids possible, fit perfectly and verified, supposed to be doing. So from an audibility standpoint, we can't reach the levels that we want. Now, if you got a 60 decibel hearing loss, you get improved to 30 decibel. Why that's not good. That is an amazing thing. People are doing much, much better. It's sort of like if your hearing loss is an empty glass of water, if you fill that glass halfway, if you're thirsty, that's great. It's not. Hearing aids can do the same thing. It's going to restore you about halfway. That's great. And you're going to do much, much a full glass. There's more that we can do.
So is the limitation the technology, the ear, or both?
The ear, primarily. We can get the sound in. It will only tolerate, we can be uncomfortable. And a person won't put it. You can crank it up as much as you want. They're only going to go up to restore about half of their hearing loss because of it.
Can you develop tolerance to it? In other words, can you acclimate to the point where you can tolerate more gain?
Yes and no. Usually what is
That's a great academic answer, right?
Exactly. Usually what's ideal is to get as most benefit as you can or as audibility as you can. That's going to top out at about half of the loss. Start out lower than that. Because that amount is too much for them. Even that, so they do need to build up, and they can successfully build up and get a tolerance to sound. A half.
So where does this fit in terms of meeting targets with probe microphone measurements?
Now, the probe microphone measurements, as your listeners, is just a measurement where you put a small microphone inside the ear and then put the hearing aid on and measure in the ear and compare that loudness increase or the boost that's been to some targets for that degree of hearing loss. So how does it relate to doing what many people recommend doing is you want to get the right pattern or the right amount of amplification at each pitch level for that shape of hearing loss. This hearing loss is
so going across the full spectrum of frequency, you want to get the same amount of gain from the hearing aid, correct?
Or the appropriate amount for that degree of loss. So one frequency may have very little loss, and so you have very little gain. You have a lot of loss, so you have more gain there. So the important thing is to manage whatever that shape is, but not hit the targets. Bring it lower the target so a person can get used to it and then gradually build it up. A lot of the newer hearing aids are so that you put it on target and the hearing aid will actually in target. And every time you close the battery door, which means every morning we put on the hearing aid, a little bit until after 2 weeks or whatever you set in the computer, 3 weeks or whatever, you're right where you want it to be.
Right. But in the end, if they hit targets, they're still at a low, they're not meeting full audibility. Is that correct?
That's correct. recognizes the fact that the ear won't tolerate full audibility.
And what happens if you do set the hearing aid so if you want to, get to full audibility, right? In other words, if you have let's say a 50 dB loss and you get the hearing aid to, at that particular frequency, get them back up to within 10 dB of normal with the amplification, what type of symptoms or what complaints do the patient have, or what are the problems with that?
Okay. Don't get up to full audibility. Is it?
Yeah. Well, if most people think you just want to get to full audibility, right? So what is it that stops that? It's the patient complaints, or what is it that stops that?
And patient complaints. If we program to give full audibility or more than half restoration, I can say, I haven't been wearing it. It's too loud for me. It's uncomfortable. Background sounds are in my ear. So then you bring it back down.
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting because, if you want to try to mitigate people's hearing loss, obviously you want to get as much audibility as possible. It's just
Absolutely.
What's tolerable, or what can you get to, right? And so, but is there a physiologic reason that you can't get there? So what is the reason inside the cochlea that leads to that?
It is a physiological reason. The process that sound comfortably. It's the hair cell damage primarily in that, but due to recruitment or whatever, but just aren't comfortable, aren't pleasant.
Sure. No, it's a really interesting topic, right? Because, ultimately, you don't want to just give people devices. You want those devices to give the maximum amount of rehabilitation. And so defining or finding out what that is a fascinating topic for myself, the listeners, and people with hearing loss.
Yeah, you want them to get maximum ability, but you also want it to be something they will use and not put in their dresser drawer because it wasn't pleasant.
Yeah, no, I understand. It's obviously that fine balance, because I think there's unfortunately a decent number of hearing aids that don't have enough audibility as well. And that's another reason why they end up in the nightstand drawer. And in all honesty, I think that might be more common than too much audibility, but that's a bigger topic than you and I are going to tackle today on the.
But it certainly is an issue.
Yeah. So
that comes few, not so few, but people who dispense hearing aids, whether it's audiologists or commercial hearing aids, 50% of them do probe mic measures to verify that they up where it needs to be, and usually it's set lower because that's what they say. Can you turn it down a little bit so it's more comfortable? Okay, fine. Well, you got to talk to the person and say, but as we turn it down, you're getting less and less benefit. Here's where we need to be. So we'll turn it down for the day. Get next week, see if we can get you up to it.
No, I know. I'm not sure. I think you're being a little generous on the number of people using probe mic measements, but I'll leave it at that.
You say it's less than 50%.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, obviously, is some of the as we call in the field, factory settings type of use that people use certainly give people not enough audibility in the high ranges that they should want. And so, the first fit concept is another issue that, again, I think is much bigger than this particular conversation. But, one of the other things that, as I was reading over the type of work is, I think your work on counseling is wonderful. And you talk about, or there's this concept of family-centered care. Can you explain to the listeners a little bit about what that means and what family-centered care is?
There's an audiologist. He passed away a couple years ago, age 90 something, but he was one of the fathers of audiologic rehabilitation. It was Dr. Mark Ross. And he said, if a person in the family the entire family has a hearing problem, and it's absolutely true. There's a psychologist who's now retired who did hearing loss, Dr. Sam Triken, who, when we should do away with the term hearing loss.
Yep.
He said, because he knew no one out there going to ever stop using the term hearing loss, he said we should talk about communication loss. We talk about hearing loss. The onus is on the person who has the hearing loss. If
Correct.
something wasn't heard, In reality, it's not their fault. There are speaker variables, there's environmental variables that contribute to the fact the person didn't hear.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a fascinating concept that, one of the things I tell my patients is oftentimes the reason they don't perceive their hearing loss is because they communicate effectively despite their hearing loss. And so because they compensate with speech reading and contextual processing, as long as they have a good conversation, they don't think they have a single problem. And so
sometimes it's their perception.
Correct. Well, I actually, as an aside, I think patients are actually pretty poor at perceiving what their hearing loss is, right? So, I mean, when you look at the surveys, the handicaps and things like that, they typically don't correlate with the hearing test, meaning people's perception of their impairment doesn't correlate with the measurable impairment that you see. And I think a lot of that has to do with the brain's amazing ability to compensate for hearing loss. And so, you're right. I tell patients, interestingly, the only people who are going to tell you that you have a hearing loss are the same people who tell you your fly's down. Meaning it's only the people closer to you would actually say you have a hearing loss. And so and so when you talk about that, obviously that's kind of how the hearing loss impacts the whole family. In terms of counseling or bringing people in, how does that affect how you counsel, not just obviously the patient, but the people around them?
The people around them need to be brought in. And we do surveys of audiologists, and many of them do not bring the consultation room. When they do, many of them sit on the side. They're in the room listening, but they're not actively at the table.
Right.
It's important to just start out and say, you want to talk about hearing loss, and let me get the perception first with the hearing loss. And then I also want to hear from you, so that person knows that they're going to be brought in. It's also important that that person who is accompanying that the person with the hearing loss is typically doing what they can. They are paying attention. I'd be a rich man if I could give time. A family member was there and said, well, he only hears what he wants to hear.
Yeah.
If you just pay attention, you get it. He is paying attention, and it's frustrating to them and hurtful to them because you're not really trying. And it's important that the family member also recognize the concept and respite. Vigilance, being the person with the hearing loss, is extremely vigilant things. But if you're out to dinner at a restaurant and you're trying to follow the conversation, you're the one that's exhausted from all that effort. Very possibly your mind is going to drift.
Yeah.
Just take a break. And that's to look at you and say, so what do you think, Tom? Sorry, about what?
I lost you there.
I've been paying attention. So it's very frustrating. So that person needs, okay, my back.
Yeah, there you go. Sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. And the family member needs to know his mind will wander in some situations, just briefly. Also needs to know that while that's normal, their responsibility is to pay attention as can and maybe recognize that they're getting this exhaustion from listening for a moment and say, got to go to the restroom or whatever. Just get away, take a break, and come back with the brain ready to try listening again.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard when you talk about, the first topic of audibility and then background noise stressing you out in a restaurant, and then rapid social dialogue where your eyes can't keep up with the speaker. And the other issue, obviously, with social dialogue is the topic can wander, right? It can jump from thing to thing. So there's not always a continuous thread to follow. I mean, it's definitely a challenging area. I mean, one of the other things.
Speakers.
Yeah. Or I mean, I tell most of my patients with hearing loss, they'll do perhaps okay with 4 people at a table. And then once you get over 4 people, you get 2 conversations and it becomes really, really, really difficult for them. And so kind of if they are coupled off, one other couple for dinner is probably ideal. And then anything more than that really gets onerous. And that's why family get-togethers are so difficult, right? Because there's many, many people and stuff's around. I mean, the other thing I always find interesting is some of my patients who talk about how their spouse now mumbles. And I always love that. It's like, well, were they a mumbler when you married them? No. Well, I mean, what turned them? And that's obviously the hearing loss patient's perspective on how their spouse speaks. So it's definitely a dynamic. So
Yeah.
yeah, and so moving people to taking care of the whole family or talking about the whole family is essential in terms of the loss itself, right? Because it impacts everyone.
Yeah. Hearing loss needs to be doing something, getting hearing aids, and also learning styles. And the person talking to that individual needs to learn some things as well. And introduced to some of this.
Yeah, you mean that you can't have a conversation with your back at the washing dishes at the sink with a hearing impaired person and expect them to be able to have a conversation with you?
Exactly. You can't stick your head in the refrigerator and say, "What do you want for dinner?"
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting thing, and obviously there are age related things too, right? Obviously older spouses are perhaps a little more patient. It's fascinating the impact on grandchildren and how kind of brutally honest they are about grandma or grandpa and how well they hear, and that's a whole other family dynamic, right? High pitched grandchildren, high pitched voiced grandchildren who aren't the most patient about the fact that grandma or grandpa can't hear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so in that field, how have you seen it move along over your time and expertise within? So when you first, over the years, how has that got kind of worked its way into the practice of audiology?
Working on the family dynamic and communication dynamic.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, not as well as it should. In the early days of the profession, following the profession really kind of got its roots, it was very heavily centered in audiologic rehabilitation and learning how to compensate for what the hearing aid wasn't doing and helping a member compensate as well and learning those things. And as hearing aids got better, that kind of fell by the wayside. It also fell by the wayside, I believe, because audiology moved away from the rehab aspect of hearing, beginning up with behavioral side of lesion tests to help the ENT diagnose, what is the problem? Conductive, sensory, neural. And then we ended up with impedance measures and electrophysiologic measures and photoacoustic emissions, all what it was. And we kind of drifted that way and left the rehab. We're kind of coming back to that a little bit, but slowly. A survey a few years ago with a student at the University of Cincinnati, surveying audiologists on how often they provide communication suggestions to patients. Is much lower than we would have liked. And then, of course, another problem is when suggestions, often what we do is we give them a list of suggestions, say, the hearing aid is great. They're not going to restore hearing completely. You'll still have some problem, but these suggestions go for you, and we give that to them. But they don't work that way. Dr. Brene Brown, who is a renowned vulnerability researcher, said that belonging is, I forget the exact words she said, but belonging or fitting in. In other words, we want to belong. It is because of our desire to belong, well, because we want to be like everybody else. We don't want to point out our difference. We don't want to have a list of communication suggestions, say, I need you to do this because I am different. I have a hearing loss. Can you do this? We want to point out our hearing loss. And so we don't use those things unless they're presented to the patient and the family member from a motivational engagement standpoint. How important is it to you to do this? Very important. How comfortable are you saying, can you move away from this noise source with me and come over here to talk? Identifying you have hearing loss. And then why are you uncomfortable with that? Conversations don't take long when doing that, but it makes a world of difference as far as adaptation to it.
Yeah, it seems definitely the strategies work better when you're asking them to implement them with family members than they do in a social context, right? Because people, part of socializing is minimizing, drawing attention to certain things and kind of having a get along attitude, right? Not, oh, you want to have a conversation with me, you have to do these 4 things that I need you to do so I can have a conversation. Unfortunately, most people kind of be like, yeah, appreciate it. Is there somebody else at this cocktail party I can talk to?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that recent book I did, this little consumer guide called Hearing to the Max. There's stories in there. One of them is about a gentleman that I had told, when you go out to dinner with friends, they all know you have a hearing loss already. Why not just start out by saying, I'm going to give you 2 signs, and I need these. If I go like this, it means speak up a bit, I'm not getting it. If I go like this, it means slow down a bit, you're going too fast. And then I asked him, how comfortable would you be doing that? Not at all. You're like, no way. But with some discussion, he realized, he's going to stop going out with this group because he can't hear. Is that better than at least introducing this? And what are the other people going to do? Roll their eyes and get up from the table and say, don't come back next time we have,
No. What they do is they struggle through it. And then the next time when they're driving home with their wife, they say, I like them, but it's too much work and I get tired of repeating myself. So next time they ask us to dinner, let's say maybe not. And it's a much more subtle disconnection than actually tackling your hearing loss. So no, I mean, I think that's a really great point in terms of it. And I have some patients who actually have badges that say, I have a hearing loss. They obviously hug it. And, obviously, I think some of that has to do with the personality with which they entered into having the hearing loss, right? So some of the more forward, gregarious, comfortable people. And so, unfortunately, hearing loss is like really terrible for somebody who's already shy.
Well, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, not that it's not terrible for everybody, but it just compounds the shyness.
Absolutely. And it takes more time with that patient to help them learn how to assert themselves. And it's okay to assert yourself. I'm not an assertive person. I remember the first time I went out to dinner with my wife when we were dating, and she sent her steak back to the kitchen because it wasn't cooked right. And I thought, I would have eaten it. Some people just naturally are more assertive, but those that aren't assertive can be trained to speak up for what they need.
Yeah. So you now get your steak done correctly, I assume.
I do. I will say something now.
Fair enough.
I follow my example.
Sounds like it worked out. So that's wonderful. And so, if there was any takeaway from a practitioner point of view, what would you say in terms of this topic? Like, what are the things people really need to keep in mind?
From the practitioner point of view?
And I mean, because by and large, the practitioner point of view is the patient point of view, if that makes sense. Like, patients get what we do. Like if you say what practitioners should do, patients go, oh yeah, that's what my practitioner should tell me to do.
Right. Well, number one would be bring in the family member, make sure they're actively involved in sitting at the table and you're drawing them out and getting their opinions. Talk to them about the limitations of hearing aids and what they can do as a spouse to improve that, and what the person with the hearing loss can do to help that residual deficit. And talking about comfort level, those things, and work them through that.
Yeah, no, I think, that's, not to, from a timeliness point of view, I think the over-the-counter discussion with hearing aids has kind of turned out to be a little bit like Y2K and the concerns about information technology. But that being said, contextually, what we're talking about, like these are the things that, people who are trying to self-treat their hearing loss are just never going to get, right? And I think that's a huge part of what professional support can do for people to really get them to function as best as possible, right? I mean, everybody has a coach. Tom Brady had a coach. I mean, everybody, Tiger Woods has a coach. Everybody has a coach, right?
Right.
Well, John, this has been great. Let me ask you a question. What's your favorite sound?
Water. Not water in the sink, but the waves, being by the ocean. Find it very relaxing and sort of back to nature.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And ironically, I think we both are landlocked people. So
well, we did move further east, so now I'm only about an hour and a half away from the ocean.
Oh, okay. So you well, there you go. Less landlocked, but that's not all bad. So, well, this has been great. You're working on writing, it sounds like. And if people want to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
They get in touch with me by email if they wanted to. My email address is jg.clark@uc.edu.
All right, that's great. And so, this has been a really great conversation. to have this, with us. And, this is Dr. John Greer Clark. He's the author of Introduction to Audiology and has done a lot of great work. And I really appreciate you sharing your perspective on really important topics, audibility and patient-centered counseling, which I think are really two. I know you've written many books about patient counseling. We've just really scratched the surface on it. I don't know if you're working on more books, but I do know you're working on the 14th edition of Introduction to Audiology, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been great exploring this topic that you're clearly passionate about, and I'm passionate about. This has been wonderful.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Sims. This has been great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So.
Thanks for tuning in to the Listen Up podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get updates on future episodes.